Hello, you're welcome. Catherine Foley is my name, and I'm going to read today from my book Beyond the Breakwater. And today's chapter is chapter 35, The Helvick Summer. And this was the first story I ever had published back in July 1992. It was published in You magazine, a women's magazine at the time. So I hope you like it. And it is Friday, so slán to wahagad galéir. Igreena ortha galéir. So the Helvick Summer. My father and I made for an ungainly pair walking down to the pier in our oilskins in the morning that summer, staggering under the weight of all the gear that we carried. We had to manage the oars, the spurs, the fish box, a bucket of bait, a life jacket, the petrol tank, 2 knives, rope and a few other odds and ends. Sometimes my mother would run us down in the car, but mostly we walked down by ourselves. Fishing with your father sounds like a good idea, and it was, but mostly we lost out on the fun and we fished in silence. I'd wait stony-faced while he started the ending. "Taring an taid shinnishtach," he'd say, "pull that rope in," making his way down to show me how it was done. I hated being shown what to do. I'd sit in the bow, sometimes toying with the notion of slipping over the gunwale into the waves. My father was always a thoughtful man with a great sense of fun. He could tell a story and you'd be smiling in no time if you were in his company. He was good with people, but with me, that summer at least, he was at a loss. I was a 20-year-old college student who'd come home to fish for lobsters. Many of my friends were travelling to Germany or Denmark that summer to find work in hotels or building sites or in bars, but I thought I'd stay home and earn money fishing with my father. The idea had appealed to me at first, but the lobsters were scarce and the weather wasn't great, and I began to resent both the work and being at home. All summer we fished, and if I opened my mouth at all, it was usually to argue with my father. Once loaded and in the boat, he'd begin to pull in the anchor and start pumping juice into the engine. I had my own jobs, but he was always nervous of me in the boat. He sat and steered from the stern, worried in case we'd run aground or capsize in a freak wave. The engine did cut out on us one day. We just dropped a line of 16 pots. He pulled the starter again and again as we bobbed up and down in the swell, but the engine died with each tug. "We'll have to row back," he said, worried about getting too close to the rocks. "Will you be able?" "Of course. Come on," I said, pulling an oar out, almost losing it in the waves with the effort. We exhausted ourselves rowing until we finally rounded the pier into Helvick. It was only when we'd rested that my father realised that the petrol tank was empty and only in need of a refill from the spare gallon that he always carried on board. The weather was bad all that summer, in keeping with my mood, which was mostly dark and sullen. But still, we had a handful of beautiful days when we'd haul in the lobster pots out near the cliffs with the sun glinting off the green water. It was a bonus if there was a lobster in the pot when we pulled it out of the sea. We'd both smile then, relishing with the excitement as water cascaded from the mesh. "That's a fine one, just the right size," he'd say. "The bit of sun makes all the difference. If we had another few days like this, we'd make a good few bob. What do you think, Katie? Will we come out this evening for a few mackerel? We might fill the box." I'd give him a nod and he'd continue. "Do you know, if a fella had a bigger boat, he could make a fortune." The idea of spending my holidays getting a tan, pulling pots like a Greek fisherman and lolling around the pier with the locals had initially appealed to me. But my hands were soon cut and rough. My feet slithered about in an old pair of loose runners, squishing away as I moved about the boat. My hair, which was closely cropped that year, became matted and sticky from the spray, and I stopped washing it altogether. Shuffling down in the cold grey to a deserted pier at 7:30 in the morning to catch the tide is no fun. As the days passed, my scowl deepened. I wore a faded sweatshirt and a pair of dirty jeans cut off at the knees. I was deeply unhappy, convinced that I was a shapeless, insignificant lump without any redeeming features. As we pulled up to the pier one day, 2 fishermen came over to lend a hand so we could dock alongside their trawler. "Throw that line up here like a good man," one of them shouted down to me. It was all the confirmation I needed. I'd been called a young man, and no one had even batted an eyelid. A few days later, as I walked out of the ladies' toilets on the pier, a woman stared at me, doing a double take as she looked from me to the Manaw sign on the doorway overhead. We spent our nights in the kitchen while the midges outside pitted themselves against the lighted window. Dada washed his supper down with a drink of Guinness. He and Mama chatted while I gorged myself on crab claws, bread and cheese. I felt myself expand, my stomach swelling and my bottom spreading into my thighs. Did I say the lobsters were scarce? We caught fewer and fewer each week. When we did, I had to put rubber bands around their pinchers to stop them from fighting. You'd hear them clacking away as we lowered the box into the water where we kept them alive until the dealer came to buy them once a week. It was bright and crystal clear out beyond the headland the day I stabbed the conger eel. We were heaving the pots up from the seabed and were nearing the last one. I shivered involuntarily when I saw him trapped in one of the pots. His long body, as thick as a man's arm, moved about, slithering slowly inside. His jaws opened wide as he twisted himself about and tried to bite down on the plastic-covered wire mesh. I tried to manoeuvre him out through the neck of the trap, turning it upside down. Finally, he fell out heavily onto the boards. He tried to squirm away, and he had almost made it under the board to the belly of the bilge underneath, but I hunched down and stuck the knife into his head. He eyeballed me with 2 black, steady eyes. Then, using the knife, I hoisted him up onto the thwart and held the blade steady. He tried to twist away. His strength travelled up my arm like a current. I gritted my teeth at the crunching sounds his bones made against the blade, and I felt like a murderer. Still, I held the knife steady, and I savoured the kill. I should have kept him for bait. I should have cut him up and thrown the pieces in the bucket, but I wasn't thinking of practicalities like that. I only wanted to get rid of him, and so with great effort I lifted him up on the hilt of the knife and heaved him over the side. He slipped over the gunwale and into the water. I saw him sink slowly underneath us. It was as if my own blackness and confusion slipped away down with him. As he disappeared, my summer mood lifted, and I slowly began to feel exultant. The spray soaked us as we travelled home on the tide that day. I smiled and looked ahead, bracing myself for another soaking. We looked in towards shore, and I saw the cars driving along the road into Dungarvan. They were only landlubbers, not hunters of the deep like us. I asked my father if he wanted to go out fishing for mackerel that evening, and we headed off after tea. We shouted to the others who were dropping lines close by. "Are ye catching many? Is the buyer coming tonight? Nachwil Shagadassanish, isn't it nice now?" Mackerel were breaking the surface in silvery flashes all around. Seagulls were screeching and swooping as I pulled in 6 mackerel at a time on my line. They danced sharp jigs on the boards before they lay still. The sun's orange light steeped the whole place in fire before it began to sink behind the Knockmeal Down mountains. "Isn't it lovely now?" my father said. "It is," I agreed. And I asked him then if he'd seen the eel I'd killed earlier in the day. No, did you keep him for bait? He wondered. I did not, I told him, disappointed with myself that I hadn't thought of it. Was he big? He was a monster. I could hardly lift him up on the knife. You wouldn't have kept him yourself for bait. Oh, I don't know what we'll do with you at all, he said, laughing. And I had to smile as the two of us pulled in our lines and headed back. It was near the end of the summer, and I was soon heading back to university in Cork. My father was sad to finish. Pulling pots absorbed him completely. That was years ago. Years later, over a drink in Murray's, we'd recall the summer we had spent fishing for lobsters, and we'd smile at the memory of it all. And it's only now I know that it was a summer we would never have again. So, go dtí amárach, slán tamil agus slán tuathagah go léir.